Hello, and welcome to the second session of World Water Day 2022, hosted by the Water Institute here at the University of Waterloo. My name is Kevin White. I'm a PhD student in the Collaborative Water Program and the representative for the Water Institute's Graduate Student Association. I'm joined today by my colleague, Ashley.
Hi, I'm Ashley Benjamin. I'm a fourth-year undergraduate student in honors science with minors in chemistry and earth sciences. I am also here as a representative of my Arts 490 class, which looks at the knowledge and ethics surrounding water in the world. This course is interdisciplinary by nature and brings students from across campus to analyze water globally.
We're thrilled to be joined this afternoon by Dr. Ingrid Waldron and Monica Lewis-Patrick, two fantastic speakers and high-profile advocates leading community-level resistance movements against environmental racism across Canada and the United States. We're grateful for RBC for their generous support of this event and helping to give these speakers a platform today.
Environmental racism is not an emergent issue in North America. In particular, Black and Indigenous communities have been disproportionately affected by discriminatory policies and actions by governments that affect their environment and health. As a result, these groups have a long history of fighting for the protection of air, land, and water that we all share. But even though clean water is considered by the United Nations to be a basic human right, many of these communities in North America still lack access. Therefore, it is imperative to have discussions like these to address the pressing issues related to environmental racism.
As part of our own efforts to address the legacy of racism in Canada, we acknowledge that much of our work at the University of Waterloo takes place on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. Our main campus is situated on the Haldimand Tract, the land granted to the Six Nations that includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. This acknowledgement is only a small step in the process of reconciliation. The University of Waterloo actively works towards reconciliation through research, learning, teaching, and community building, centralized within the Office of Indigenous Relations. We encourage all of you to reflect on the Indigenous territories on which you live and work, wherever you may be joining us from today.
This event will consist of 2 30-minute keynote talks, followed by a moderated Q&A session with questions taken from the Arts 490 Global Engagement Seminar students here at the University of Waterloo. If you have a question for our speakers, we encourage that you reach out to them directly after the event.
Our first guest this afternoon is the 2022 Water Institute RBC Distinguished Lecturer, Dr. Ingrid Waldron. Dr. Waldron is Professor and Hope Chair in Peace and Health in the Global Peace and Social Justice Program in the Department of History in the Faculty of Humanities at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario. Her research, teaching, and community advocacy work focus on the structural and environmental determinants of health and mental health disparities in Black, Indigenous, immigrant, and refugee communities in Canada, including environmental racism, climate inequities, mental illness, and COVID-19. She's also the founder and director of the Environmental Noxiousness, Racial Inequities, and Community Health Project, and the co-founder and co-director of the Canadian Coalition for Environmental and Climate Justice. You may also know her as the author of There's Something in the Water, Environmental Racism in Indigenous and Black Communities, which was turned into a 2020 Netflix documentary of the same name. She's currently writing her next book titled From Enlightenment to Black Lives Matter, The Impact of Racial Trauma on Mental Health in Black Communities. Dr. Waldron, welcome.
Good afternoon, thank you. Okay, so let me just share my screen. So I'm going to talk about the legacy of environmental racism in Canada, but also just briefly look at the intersection of environmental racism and climate change, because I think there are some really interesting intersections between the two issues. But I'm going to begin with a quote. From a traditional perspective, the health of our peoples cannot be separated from the health of our environment. the practice of our spirituality, and the expression of our inherent right to self-determination, upon which the mental, physical, and social health of our communities is based. And this is a quote from the International Indian Treaty Council. So across Canada, as many of us know, environmental chaos in the form of environmental racism and climate devastation has had negative social, political, and health effects in Indigenous and Black communities. So in this presentation, what I would like to do is examine the legacy of environmental chaos and resistance in these communities by looking at the ecological, health, and social impacts of environmental racism in both communities, the intersection between environmental racism and climate change inequities in Indigenous and Black communities, how my environmental noxiousness, racial inequities, and community health project has been grappling with trying to address both environmental racism and climate change inequities over the last, now it's I think 10 years that I've been doing this, and also how community mobilizing and resistance in Indigenous and Black communities in Canada have led to significant wins over the last several years. We talk a lot about the problems, but sometimes we don't think about the wins. You know, there have been several wins over the last several years that I think are really important. And while we still have a ways to go, it's always important to celebrate wins. So what is environmental racism? This was a question that was posed to me often when I began the project in 2012. You know, it was a question posed to me by journalists and community members. They thought it was a very strange term and wanted to get a sense of how the environment could be racist, which certainly I understand. It is a kind of weird term. In 2013, when I started the project, I decided to go down and meet the communities that were impacted. And one of the communities was Lincolnville. It's an African Nova Scotian community in Nova Scotia called Lincolnville. And we met with a few community members, including the person you see on the screen here by the name of James Desmond, who's a longtime environmental activist. And we filmed the workshops or the meetings that we held in these communities. And when we asked him how he would define environmental racism, he gave us this definition, which I always use because I think it's extremely simple, but at the same time, very layered. And what James says here, of course, is the practice has been locating industrial waste sites next to African Nova Scotian Native and poor white communities, communities that don't have a base to fight back. You ask if that's environmental racism, it's environmental racism to its core. And yes, it looks really simple, but when you kind of investigate this quote further, you see that he's talking about disproportionality. He's talking about specific communities, those that are racialized, but also those who are poor are disproportionately chosen for the siting of industrial waste sites and other environmental hazards. But he also says it's the same communities that don't have a base to fight back. They don't have a base to fight back because these are the communities, because they're racialized, because they are of low socioeconomic status, because they live in rural environments, they don't have political, economic, and social clout. And individuals or communities that don't have that type of clout are the last to be heard by government. So basically, he's expressing those sentiments. But even his inclusion of white communities is also interesting because we typically think that environmental racism impacts racialized communities only. It does disproportionately, but there are some white communities, typically, of course, those that are low income, because a low income white community would be less likely to be heard by government than an affluent white community. But there are white communities that have been impacted, certainly. Flint, Michigan, we heard a lot about Flint, Michigan's water crisis in 2014, and that was a community that was mixed. It was low income, white and Black communities. And in Nova Scotia, there's a community called Harrietsfield, which is a low income rural white community, and they've been trying to address water contamination since the 1980s. So every now and then, yes, of course, it does impact communities that are not BIPOC communities. But I want to also provide you with a definition, a much more academic definition of environmental racism from Dr. Robert Bullard, who's an African-American teaching in Texas currently, and he's considered to be the father of environmental justice. And he says that environmental racism, similar to James Desmond, it's about the disproportionate location, greater siting of toxic industries in Indigenous and other racialized communities. Therefore, these are the communities that have greater exposure to toxic burdens. He says it's about lack of political power, so very similar to what James says. These are the communities that have very little political power. They're less likely to be heard by government. So it's very difficult for them to get their concerns heard while they are engaged in ongoing resistance because of that lack of political power, because they often don't seem to have a voice where it concerns government. It's very difficult. It might take years for them to get redress. It's also about the implementation of policy. So environmental racism and the spatial patterning of industry, of course, doesn't just happen. Just like any other form of systemic racism, it comes out of policy, right? Whether you're talking about the educational system or the immigration system or labor or the healthcare system, the outcome, the impacts on communities is often or is always about policy and decision-making and who gets to make policy and who gets to make decisions. With respect to environmental racism, it's certainly not the impacted communities that are in the decision-making seat, right? It's typically people who are not impacted, but people who are not BIPOC communities that get to decide where a landfill gets placed. So this is about, ultimately, it's about environmental policy. It's also about the disproportionate negative impacts of environmental policies that often result in differential rates of cleanup. So that's when you have to ask, why does it take 70 years or 40 years in the case of Pictou Landing First Nation, 70 years in the case of Shelburne, a Black community in Nova Scotia? Why does it take that long for them to get cleanup, right? So once again, it's about the policies, but it's also about how slow it takes to have any kind of redress in these communities. And finally, environmental racism is about that history and legacy of excluding the people who are most impacted. So as I said earlier, the people who should be at the table, the people whose voices we should be hearing around policy and decision-making, they don't have a seat at the table. So as long as they don't have a seat at the table, environmental racism will manifest intergenerationally over time. So it's going to be very difficult to address it if we don't hear from the people who are most impacted. We don't hear from them about their priorities, how they see environmental racism, how it impacts them, what they think decision-making should look like. So that manifests over time and it keeps environmental racism going. So I want to provide a few case studies of environmental racism in Canada over the last several decades. I hate to say several decades, but that's the case. So I'm going to begin with Nova Scotia, which is where I started my work. And this is Saba-Ganagadi First Nation. So between approximately 2014 and last year, 2021, Saba-Ganagadi First Nation had opposed the development by Alton Gas of a brine discharge pipeline near the Shubenacadie River in Nova Scotia. And of course, there were concerns about fish and just even climate change. What is this pipeline project going to do to the well-being of this community? Pictou Landing First Nation is another community, a community that I would say that this particular case is one of the worst cases of environmental racism in Canada. Starting in 1967, Northern Pulp Mill started dumping effluent into Boat Harbor. And that continued to happen over the years, even though there were calls to close the mill, particularly starting in the 1980s when really strong resistance grew to this particular project. And we can talk a little bit later about this project, but the mill was finally closed in 2020. So this is a highly contaminated site where community members would say that it links to high rates of cancer and other illnesses, respiratory illness in their community. You've got Anjinwang First Nation. I would say perhaps the worst case of environmental racism in Canada. It's often referred to as Chemical Valley, which kind of tells you all you need to know. This is a community near Sarnia that is surrounded by over 60 petrochemical facilities. So it groups over 60 petrochemical facilities within a 25 square kilometer area, and similar to the other communities, They would say that higher rates of cancer, reproductive cancers, reproductive illnesses, respiratory illness, birth anomalies, etc., is due to the petrochemical industry surrounding this community. I'm sure we've heard a lot about Grassy Narrows First Nation. It was recently in the news, I think this week, evidence coming out, not that we really needed that study to tell us that the high rates of illness in this community is due to mercury contamination. So starting in the 1960s and 1970s, this community, which is near Kenora, Ontario, has been concerned about mercury contamination of the Wabagoon English River that has caused so many illnesses in this community. I think the community that's getting perhaps the most attention now, and perhaps over the last 4 years, is Wet'suwet'en First Nation in northern BC. Over the last several years, mass demonstrations, sit-ins and blockades and other kind of activism, grassroots mobilizing have gripped parts of Canada over the movement to support the leaders of Wet'suwet'en First Nation, who are opposing this multi-billion-dollar pipeline project in northern BC. There are Black communities that are impacted by environmental racism. I think often Black communities are not thought of when we talk about environmental racism. And there are several cases of Black communities that have to contend with pollution and environmental degradation. Many of them are in Nova Scotia. I can't really explain why that would be, although I think the fact that Black communities in Nova Scotia are not only extremely low income, but they also reside in isolated places. So we call them historic Black communities. As you know, African Nova Scotians have been in Canada for almost 400 years. So this is not an immigrant community. These are descendants of Black loyalists from the United States after the War of 1812, descendants of Jamaican Maroons, descendants of people from Sierra Leone. So they've been in Nova Scotia for over 400 years, and they were pushed into isolated places, isolated geographic areas. So I think the fact that they are racialized individuals, low income, and also reside in isolated places that are often forgotten by government contributes to why many African Nova Scotians have to contend with environmental racism. Extremely historic Black community in Nova Scotia is Africville. It no longer exists, but the descendants of Africville, of course, are still living. And they had to contend with both gentrification or urban renewal and environmental racism. So at that time, the city of Halifax wanted to make way for industrial development, and they wanted the community out. They wanted to push the community out, and they did. So the community was expropriated out of Africville to other areas of Halifax, urban area. So this was an urban Black community, which is kind of rare. As I said, most of the Black community are in rural or isolated places. So they were pushed into other areas and literally pushed out. You know, there are photos of residents of Africville being taken out by dump trucks. Their church was burnt down, I think, as a way to get them out quickly. So it's clearly an example of urban renewal, if you want to call it that, or gentrification. But while that was happening, a lot of environmental and social hazards were left in its wake of that industrial development. And those environmental hazards included a fertilizer plant, a slaughterhouse, a tar factory, a stone and coal crushing plant, a cotton factory, a prison, 3 systems of railway tracks, and an open dump. Here is Lincolnville. You saw a photo of James Desmond earlier. He provided us with a definition of environmental racism. Lincolnville has had to contend with a first and second generation landfill in 1974 and 2006, respectively. This is a photo that my research assistant took in 2013 when we visited the community, as I said. And once again, like the other communities, they would say that ever since the dump in 1974 was placed there, they've seen increasing rates of cancer in their community. And here's Shelburne. If you saw the documentary film, you would have met Louise DeLille, who is an environmental activist in the Black community of Shelburne, Nova Scotia. So all the way back in 1942, this dump, they would call it the Morvan Road landfill. The community thinks landfill is too polite of a term, so they could just call it the Shelburne Town Dump. So whenever I say it's a landfill, they said, no, it's a dump. So this has been there since 1942, and they would say that everything and anything went into this dump. It accepted waste from everywhere and everything. And once again, as you may have seen in the documentary film, they have extremely high rates of cancer. When I met Louise back in 2015, she said to me that about 90% of the people have cancer in her community. And of course, initially I didn't believe it because I thought, well, that's strange. I've never heard of anything like that. But then I thought back to a community in the United States near Louisiana that they call Cancer Alley, where a lot of people have cancer as well. And I thought, well, I guess it's possible. It could certainly be a reality. So there is, for me, a clear connection between environmental racism and climate change, climate devastation in racialized communities. So Indigenous, Black, and other racialized and marginalized communities in the global North and South are disproportionately vulnerable to the climate crisis because they are more likely, so this is one reason, if they are more likely to experience pollution from industry, then of course that contributes to emissions of, obviously emissions. So the same communities that are dealing with or more vulnerable to climate change will be the communities that are impacted mostly by pollution. But what also connects both issues is the fact that the communities are communities that are dealing with long-standing structural inequities. So when we say that people who are racialized are dealing with climate change in very specific ways, or they're dealing with climate change worse or in unique ways, we're not saying that other communities are not impacted by climate change. We all are. Rising sea levels, changes in temperatures, we are all impacted by that. But when you are a community that has dealt with longstanding structural inequities within all of our social systems, and you lack the resources to first equip yourself from the onslaught of climate change, and then after climate change hits, you also don't have the resources and networks to come back from, survive, and address climate change impacts. That has everything to do with racism. That has everything to do with communities that have had to deal with colonialism. So it's like a Band-Aid approach when we ask communities to do certain things to engage in climate change mitigation. It's a Band-Aid or adaptation. It's a Band-Aid approach. If those communities lack the resources, lack the skills, lack the professional networks, lack the ear of government, it's a Band-Aid approach, right? When people say, well, dealing with climate change means you deal with racial injustice, that is what they mean. If we don't deal with those longstanding structural inequities that these communities face, it's very difficult for these communities to address and equip themselves with the resources that they require to prepare themselves for climate change impacts. So for me, that is what connects both issues, is that similar to environmental racism is very similar. These are communities that don't have the ear of government. They are dealing with longstanding structural inequities, making it difficult or challenging for them to address both of these issues. So that's why the climate change narrative has to be very inclusive and intersectional. The climate science framework or narrative is strong, and I will never say that it's not important. Of course it's important. We need to hear about climate science. I think what's missing right now is a climate change narrative that understands that we have to understand it through an intersectional analysis that is inclusive of race, gender identity, sexual orientation, social class, disability, age, and immigrant status. All of these things will determine the extent to which people are impacted by climate change and their ability to get out of it or to come back from it or address it. So in Canada and elsewhere, we're starting to engage with a climate justice framework, not enough in my opinion, but that is what essentially climate justice is about. It's about recognizing that people will deal with it in different ways, but they will be impacted in many ways, first and worst. And that's similar, once again, to environmental racism. Certain communities, we need an environmental justice framework, just like we need a climate justice framework, because we have to recognize that this is not an essentialist issue. It's an issue that's going to impact people differently depending on their social status and where they sit in the world. So where they sit on the socio-political, economic hierarchy. So that's real, right? So that those are things that we need to center more in our environmental discourse and narrative. So how have I been dealing with, through my Enrich project, with both issues, primarily environmental racism, though I've come to the issue of climate change more recently, last year. But I'm going to talk about how I've been trying to address the issue through the Environmental Noxiousness, Racial Inequities, and Community Health Project, which I started, as I said, in 2012. And I designed it to be community-based, community-engaged, multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, multi-method, multimedia, but also intersectional, to look at the ecological impacts, the social impacts, and most importantly to me, the health impacts, since I am a health researcher. What I needed to do first, I was quite aware of that, is awareness raising, because that funny little concept called environmental racism really escaped a lot of people. But as I said, I got emails from people saying, I don't understand this term. How can the environment be racist? And I thought, well, particularly in Nova Scotia in the beginning, I really needed to raise awareness about this issue. If I want people to be empathic and I want to incite people to action, they have to know what it's about, right? You can only get people to feel empathy on an issue if they are fully aware of that issue. So I've continued to do that over the years, which is to hold events of different kinds, workshops, community workshops, academic and public symposiums, conferences, film screenings, and other public engagement events that bring together audiences from diverse sectors, but also panelists and speakers who can talk about the issue from diverse perspectives, you know, politicians, your grassroots community mobilizer, your educator, your community organization, just like we all do when we plan, you know, events. We want people from different perspectives. I wanted to share those different perspectives with an audience. One of the great things that has come out of these events is that people then get connected to the issue, and then I hear from people like days after that they want to know how to help me. How can I help and support the Enrich project? How can I help the communities on the front line? That's always something that is, particularly in Nova Scotia, that has come out of these events. And it's really helpful, particularly when, you know, if I don't have a grant and people want to volunteer, of course, that's, you know, I'm really grateful for that help in between grants. So that's been something that's ongoing that I continue to do, because I realize that there's always going to be people who don't understand the term. My project has also been about multimedia. And of course, multimedia contributes to awareness raising, but it's also its own thing. And one of the things that I wanted to do was to just provide evidence, you know, because there were a lot of naysayers in the beginning. And I had a research assistant who was a health geographer. And he said, well, why don't you map it? Why don't you map cases of toxic industries in Mi'kmaq, which is the Indigenous community in Nova Scotia, and African Nova Scotian communities? And I said, this is a great idea, because this is not just an educational tool, but it's also a policy tool. And he did a really great job in terms of mapping cases of environmental racism, specifically incinerators, landfills, pulp and paper mills, and there's one more that escapes me right now. But also, as a health geographer, he was able to also do an annotated bibliography on the health effects of the material that you will find within each of these toxic sites, using information from the EPA website and other websites. So that's also part of this mapping process. And, you know, when we released this or published it, it got a lot of attention. And I got, you know, emails from professors who said, we would love to use this. And there are a lot of professors that are using this map, particularly at Dalhousie, which was when I released it, when I was there, using this in their classroom. So I think what this is another tool in my toolbox that provides evidence, just like research could provide evidence and statistical data and mixed methods research. This is another form of data collection and data that can be presented to policymakers and just in classrooms as well. And of course, the documentary, which has been extremely exciting for me. It's a long story, but I connected with Elliot Page at the end of 2018 through Twitter, of all places. And I talked about this often, that I couldn't believe it, didn't understand why he was reaching out to me. Like, I'm still a bit dumbfounded by it, but we had conversations at the end of 2018 and early 2019. He came up to Halifax April 13th of 2019, filmed over the course of 6 days. The plan was not to do a documentary film. It was to do 10-minute video clips that we would post on Twitter. And then it became bigger and bigger because I wanted it to be bigger and bigger, because my thought was, if we really wanted to create awareness about environmental racism in Canada or in Nova Scotia as well, then why not go big or go home? So I suggested that we do a full-length documentary and take it to TIFF and take it to different film festivals. And they surprisingly agreed, and they went back to the drawing board in a way. And they spent the summer of, that's Elliot and the co-director Ian Daniel. They spent the summer of 2019 getting it ready for the Toronto International Film Festival submission, and we were accepted. And there we are at the Toronto International Film Festival at the Elgin Theatre, where it premiered on September 9th, 2019. And this was so exciting. It was exciting to have certainly a film based on your book, your very first book, because that was my very first book, screened at TIFF, but also Elliot's publicist set up a whole slew of media interviews for us one day. So we're running all over town, trying to speak with, speaking with different media outlets, television, newspaper, the Los Angeles Times, the Entertainment Tonight Canada, Rolling Stone magazine, Time magazine. I mean, this is a dream of an academic. When we talk about knowledge mobilizing, this is not exactly what we think of, because we don't expect this to happen. But first, having your film screen, which is sharing in a way your data, your research, but also to speak to all these media outlets, is further knowledge mobilizing, and it's getting the word out there. It's getting awareness out there about environmental racism. So it was incredibly thrilling for me to be there and to speak with so many media outlets. And then later in October of 2019, it was confirmed that it was going to start streaming on Netflix. I knew that was going to happen probably earlier that year, but it was finalized in October of 2019. So of course, now this is getting out to even more people around the world. And I have to say that I wasn't actually on Netflix before 2019, not for any particular reason, but I just didn't think I had the time to watch even more television, because I watch enough television. So it was 2019, I think, but not because of the documentary. I just decided, okay, I'll subscribe to Netflix. So I don't think I really understood the global impact or relevancy of Netflix before 2019. And now I do, because since it started streaming, immediately after, actually, I heard from people around the world saying how the women in the film has inspired them. What can I do? I can't believe this is happening in Canada. I can't believe it's happening in Nova Scotia. I live in Nova Scotia. I've never heard about this. And what can I do? So as we know, when you get involved in media, it's powerful, of course, and it's inspiring. And I think it has inspired many people to want to know more and to help. And I continue to use media, to create more awareness. So I continue to grant interviews to radio, podcast, television, newspapers, because I think it's powerful, And I know some people said to me they don't want to interact with media because they always get their quotes wrong or they misinterpret what they've said. And I haven't found that to be the case over the past few years. I see media as a friend. I know it can be an enemy, but I haven't had any negative experiences. Yes, sometimes I would like the media to say something different. I've said something and they've kind of interpreted not exactly how I'd like them to interpret it, but media for me has been extremely helpful. Of course, as an academic, I have to do research, and I've done many research studies trying to ensure that they're community-based studies. But the most recent one, the one that I'm going to start doing in the next few months, is a very multidisciplinary research project at McMaster, but it also involves Dalhousie professors. I used to teach at Dalhousie, of course, and McMaster professors, and it's so multidisciplinary. But in order to get this grant, it had to be. We've got a cancer biologist on the team. I'm a sociologist. We've got a statistician. We've got a nurse. We've got a toxicologist. We've got an architect planner. I'm missing somebody else. We got an environmental justice person who focuses on gender and environmental toxins. Incredibly multidisciplinary. And what we want to do with this research is to not just assume that high cancer rates in Shelburne is due to the dump only. And maybe it is, and the community says it is, and I know that it is. But we also want to look at things like lifestyle factors, physical activity, nutrition, diet. But we all, in addition to that, the social determinants of health, which is more my field, right? The structural determinants of health, like racism, gender, social class. We want to look at genetics, and that is Juliet Daniels' field. She's a cancer biologist who focuses specifically on race and cancer and gender. We want to look at the dump. So the planner architect is going to look at the material in the dump. And then we've got the toxicologist who's going to look at nail samples and blood and saliva, right? So we want to look at all of these things to look at the link between these issues and to identify the causal factors for high rates of cancer in Shelburne. Of course, I have to publish as an academic, and I publish like any other academic in journals, and I produce reports for community members. But I also, of course, wrote the book upon which the documentary was based, and it's my first book. It came out in April of 2018, and it was published by Fernwood Publishing. And basically, this book traces my journey conducting the Enrich project. It focuses on the voices of community members, their mobilizing activities over the years, the challenges they've experienced over the years, the wins that they've had. And then in chapter 5, I focus specifically on health and the health effects of environmental racism. And I also focus, in addition to the challenges the communities have had, the challenges that I've had in terms of engaging communities. It wasn't easy in the beginning when the community members didn't know who I was. So how do I build relationships? What were the mistakes that I made? I also talk about the mistakes that I made. I also want to be a researcher who engages in community capacity building. I don't want to just take data and then never return to communities and be one of those academics. And for this type of research, I can't be, you know, you have to give something back to the community. I just don't believe in taking from the community, taking their data and never seeing them again. So I had designed the Enrich project to be about community capacity building. And one of the things that I did with the team is to do the first water testing projects in Lincolnville and Shelburne, the two Black communities. They've always wanted to know what's in their water, what are the contaminants in their water, but they didn't want government to do it because they didn't trust government. So we built a team that included a hydrogeologist, an environmental science professor, myself, and a few students in environmental science. And we decided that we are going to do the first water testing projects. We're going to go back to the community, tell them what's in their water. We're going to do a final report, share it with the community, and engage in workshops and training to educate the community on how to manage their drinking water supply, how to address well contamination, how to keep their wells healthy. We trained environmental science students to the point where one particular environmental science student is actually leading the projects now. So this is something I'm extremely proud of. And both of those projects were very successful. So we thought that we needed to use those projects as a blueprint to form a new NGO. And in 2017, April, we formed Rural Water Watch. And this is the acronym here on the screen. And Rural Water Watch was co-founded by myself and the environmental science professor and the hydrogeologist to conduct water testing projects in rural Nova Scotian communities, not specifically Black or Indigenous, any community that is a rural Nova Scotian community. We test their water, we send them the final report, we go back into the community, we do workshops, we train students, of course, and one of those students is now leading the projects. So the environmental science professor and the hydrogeologist, these are senior individuals, but because we trained an environmental science student for the past few years, she's now leading all of these projects. While I'm no longer in Nova Scotia, and I'm no longer really part of the work being done, I continue to just get updates on what they're doing. They're just doing really wonderful work. I said earlier that I started to engage in climate change very late because I feel I have enough to deal with respect to environmental racism, which is a huge topic. But in March of 2021, I started doing work in climate change by focusing on 3 Black communities in Nova Scotia. We conducted workshops in those communities. I hired Climate Action Services, which is a group of retired climate scientists, to conduct workshops in 3 Black communities. And what I wanted to do is to kind of get a sense of the social, health, and historical things that we need to consider in asking communities to engage in climate change adaptation. These are communities that really had no connection to climate change. And to be honest, we're not really that interested in participating. But I got Louise DeLille, who's in the film, in Shelburne, to kind of engage her community in this. And I got leaders who are respected in each of the 3 Black communities to recruit. And we were able to recruit the numbers that we wanted. And after the workshops, we were told that they loved it. They were surprised that they loved it, and they said that they wanted more. So my plan is to engage more in climate change work, particularly through research. I also engage in education and training and mentorship. Over the years, I've realized how interdisciplinary environmental racism is. You know, I've had students from so many different disciplines, particularly at Dalhousie, come to me to say, I want to get involved, I want to support the Enrich Project. Students from sociology, the law school, the medical school, nursing, political science, environmental studies, geography, planning. I was kind of blown away at the fact that some of these students were interested in this topic. And then I realized, well, it makes sense, you know, because I can see why they would be interested in specific aspects of it. The environmental science students, that's obvious, but the political science students are interested in the legislation, the law students, the legislation, the sociology students, the race and the colonialism. Like the planning students, this is essentially a planning issue, environmental racism, where a toxic site goes. So it made sense, but it's really been thrilling for me because it has allowed me to learn from students who are in disciplines that are not my own, and also to learn from professors as well, because I've also been able to engage professors in multiple disciplines. So a learning experience for me, but also it supports me, right? Because it addresses the gaps that I have. As a sociologist, I don't know anything about pollution and contamination. I have no environmental science background. So that has helped me in terms of conducting these projects where somebody else can come in and support some of the work. I've also kind of engaged in legal remedies. You probably heard of Eco Justice. They've got offices across Canada. They opened up an office in 2018 in Halifax. I immediately went down and I told them about the communities that I've been working with. And I just said, can you help some of these communities? Their work is about identifying legal remedies to address environmental injustices in these communities. And they've been working with the communities that I have developed relationships with. And particularly like Shelburne and Lincolnville, although I can't, it's private information, so it's all in confidence, so I can't say where they're at right now. But I do know from Louise, who made this, who told me this, and it's not something I need to keep in confidence, that they are looking at maybe a lawsuit of some kind against the town council. So I'm happy to hear that finally. I'm very interested in environmental legislation. That to me is one of the most important things in terms of how to address environmental racism. And starting in 2015 in Nova Scotia, I helped develop the first environmental racism private members bill with Lenore Zan. And then she came to me in 2020, February, and she said, let's turn that provincial Nova Scotia private members bill into federal private members bill. And she introduced Bill C-230, the first private members federal environmental racism bill in Canada on February 26, 2020. It was approved at second reading. It was approved at amendments. The only party that did not approve it was the Conservatives. And then when the snap election was called, as you know, all private members bills die on the order paper. Since then, Elizabeth May has resurrected this bill as Bill C-226. So I'm hoping or looking to support that. I'm also engaged in national partnerships. So as I moved to McMaster in Ontario, I co-founded the Canadian Coalition for Environmental and Climate Justice. And we have engaged organizations across Canada to share our skills and resources to address environmental racism now across Canada. Much of my work has focused on Nova Scotia, but now I'm extremely excited about addressing issues across Canada. So I just want to end by just talking about some of the wins, because we talk often about the doom and gloom. So what are some of the success stories? Well, I'm happy to report that in 2021, October, Sabaginagadi First Nation, which was dealing with the Alton gas brine discharge pipeline, that project was canceled. Pictou Landing First Nation, at the end of January 2020, the pulp mill that had been dispensing effluent into Boat Harbor was closed. And you see that in the film, you see the government saying that we have to close it, and it did close at the end of January 2020. Grassy Narrows First Nation, six decades after tons of mercury were dumped into the Waterloo River, Grassy Narrows First Nation reached an agreement with Ottawa in July 2021 for $68.9 million more in funding to build a home that will care for people experiencing the health impacts of the chemical. Shelburne, the Black community in Nova Scotia, their dump was finally closed at the end of 2016. In addition, Elliott Page gifted the community with a new community well for the Black community in Shelburne, and it's in the process of being installed because the community has been on well water. So right there, some really important wins that we must remember as we continue, as the communities continue to challenge environmental racism in Canada. I'll stop there. Thanks a lot for listening.
Dr. Waldron, so much. So our second speaker this afternoon is Monica Lewis-Patrick, who will be discussing the water crisis and dismantlement of African-American neighborhoods in Detroit. She's an inspirational, accomplished, and highly educated activist fighting for water equity through We the People of Detroit, an NGO of which she is a co-founder. She serves on many national and international boards. She leads with passion and through example, and we are very much looking forward to hearing her talk. Sorry, Monica.
Thank you so much, Ash. I'm sorry. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're good.
Thank you. Thank you, Ashley, for that generous introduction. I am so grateful that I got to follow the amazing Professor Ingrid Waldron. Her presentation was phenomenal, and I'm hoping that what I will share with you will serve as a bookend to much of the work that she's already framed so brilliantly. But I just wanted to sort of give you a framework for the work that we do at We the People of Detroit. Can we go to the next slide, Julie? Julie, can you hear me? Julie, can you hear me?
Hi, Monica. I'm on slide 2 with your Detroit founders. Is that what you're seeing?
Yes, ma'am. I'm not seeing that, but that's where I want to be.
Okay, we're on slide 2.
All right, thank you so much. I guess I need to be able to see it as well. There we go. All right. Okay, on my screen, it's not showing slide 2 yet. Okay. There we go. Thanks so much, Julie. Well, just to really get started and to provide some framing and context for the work that we do at We the People of Detroit, I do serve as the president and CEO. I have the distinguished honor of participating in an amazing body of work that really spans over 13 years with these amazing women. If you're looking at it from your perspective, you would see me, and then beside me is Professor Aurora Harris. In the middle is our 92-year-old matriarch, Chris Griffith. Next to her is the amazing water warrior, none like her on the planet, Cecily McClellan. And then our brilliant strategist as it relates to funding and keeping us all on task is Deborah Taylor. The next one, please. Well, just to sort of share with you how we came into the work, we started out as 5 women of color that were just showing up every day at city council meetings, expressing the fact that we would not stand by and be treated as second-class citizens. We were very disturbed by the fact that we had seen collaboration between local and state government to take over and seize control over public education in the city of Detroit. And at that particular time, we had no idea how deeply connected these issues of austerity were in terms of not only what was happening in Detroit, but what was happening across the state of Michigan, and really what was playing out all across the nation. So in 2012, going into 13, as we saw the largest municipal bankruptcy in American history play out against the residents and citizens of Detroit, what we knew very clearly is that this bankruptcy was contrived and created in a way to seize the largest asset in North America away from what is known as Black Detroit. The next one, please, Julie. So one of the things that we had to do very quickly, because in 2012, going into 13, as we were seeing massive numbers of water shutoffs in the city of Detroit, sometimes to the tune of about 8,000 homes were shut off per week. Many times in those homes, you had anywhere from 2 to 3 family members residing in those homes. So it wasn't just what we were seeing play out in terms of the numbers, but it was also what we were seeing play out in terms of the public health harms. Well, we could not get government at any level, be it local, state, or national, to intervene. It was very difficult to get anyone in academia to weigh in, because what we found out is that Governor Snyder, who is a conservative, would actually seize the research, and he could take away any of the funding to any state-funded entity. And so many of the researchers and scholars were running scared of what was playing out in Michigan. The second thing is that we had an amazing elder by the name of Dr. Gloria House. She's a legendary figure in the city of Detroit. She actually is a renowned scholar. She is the person that created the program of African American Studies at the University of Michigan, and also did the same kind of work at Wayne State University. And what she said to all of us as Black women, she said that all of you have been to the academy. Many of you have advanced degrees in some area of expertise. It is up to you to create your own table. Don't wait for someone to call you to the table, build your own. So from there, we created something called the Community Research Collective. The research is owned and controlled by the community. It is done in collaboration with the community. Its priority is community. But we work with academics from all across the state of Michigan and all across the US, and we even have a few scholars that weigh in with us on an international level. We have built that table that initially started off with 14 scholars, activists, artists, and experts. It now has a convening body of 67 scholars, as I stated, from all across the nation and a few from around the globe. The next one, please, Julie. The first map that the community wanted us to develop, because what we found out very quickly is that we needed to visualize and digitize as much of this information as we could, because many of our residents were experiencing issues around literacy. We have a very diverse community, so there were some language barriers. We have a large undocumented community, so that too was an issue. And so we decided if we could visualize it and digitize it, we could make it easier to digest. Well, one of the first maps we put together was to be able to demonstrate to community that no, it wasn't just an individual isolated issue of people not being able to afford their water, but it actually was a citywide issue of unaffordability. So Professor Emily Kudel, who is one of the co-directors of our Community Research Collective, what she did is she said, let's take all of the information that we can gather from the water department and put it into a map. We had to sue our water department, the Detroit Water and Sewage Department. We had to sue them 8 times to access data that used to be mailed to our homes in the 70s. So when Detroit had a population of about 2 million residents, We used to get a written report every year telling us how much money had been invested, what our bond debt was, how many households have been shut off, how many homes have been restored. We find it very difficult that we had to sue our government to get this very information and then be able to cobble it together to get it out to our community. What you will see from this particular map is that in the white shaded areas, that lower southern part, that is downtown Detroit. That is riverfront property. And then if you look at the middle areas where it looks like these are some awkward looking squares and rectangles, those are two separate municipalities, Hamtramck and Highland Park. But if you look at the entire city of Detroit out in the neighborhoods, there is not one neighborhood that has not been impacted by the inability to afford the ever increasing cost of water. So even your more affluent communities like Palmer Park or East English Village, we were able to demonstrate that in East English Village, about 30% of the population in that particular neighborhood was struggling to keep water on. The next one, please, Julie. This was so important because as we were coming through the contrived bankruptcy in the city of Detroit, we also were finding that we were very quickly coming up on the Flint water crisis. Well, some of the things that we were able to share with community, and not only in the city of Detroit, but we were able to go on state record. We were able to use this information and research that was community driven and community centered to actually bring about more awareness about what caused the Flint water crisis. If you look at the deep, dark blue area, that is the city of Detroit. If you look at all of the turquoise area that goes around Detroit and then also moves up to the top of the T where the city of Flint is, Detroit provides water to 126 municipalities and townships. About 40% of the population, the entire population of the state of Michigan, gets its water from an infrastructure that was built on the backs of the residents of Detroit. We also have to share with folks that as you look at the top of that T, Flint was the largest residential customer to the city of Detroit. So as Governor Snyder and those other collaborators, co-conspirators put together and devised a plan to weaponize emergency management to weaken the city of Detroit and to also at the same time weaken the city of Flint, to force Flint to subsidize a second pipeline called the Carragandi Water Authority, it was also burdening and overtaxing the residents of Detroit by removing that relationship so that Detroit could no longer meet its financial obligations. This was a way for austerity to be used in such a way that it forced away from the control of a majority Black city, this major portion of infrastructure, into regional control by a majority white entity called the Great Lakes Water Authority. The next one, please, Julie. This here is very important for me to note because many times people think that once you've come through a bankruptcy, then all your financial needs have been met. There's been a restructuring of your bond debt, and therefore you have a clean slate. That's not what happened in the city of Detroit. All of the legacy water debt was left on the backs of the taxpayers in the city of Detroit. And one of the most egregious acts that have happened is the racist implementation of a policy that was created in the 70s by a racist judge by the name of Judge Fikens. Judge Fikens was a Federalist, and his position was to use and weaponize his position as a federal judge to suppress the Black power that was being built in the city of Detroit. So as we were seeing white flight out of the city of Detroit from as early as the 40s, 50s, and 60s, Judge Fikens was making sure that the burden of building out this infrastructure to a region rests on the backs of majority Black city known as the city of Detroit. But this here is just to demonstrate that what's happening with our wastewater system. We provide wastewater services to about 78 municipalities and townships. And what you see here is that 83% of the cost of processing the wastewater and the runoffs for those municipalities, that burden is on the city of Detroit. These 78 municipalities are allowed to split among themselves 17% of that cost. So just that particular inequitable, unjust, and racist policy will keep the city of Detroit in a constant state of not only financial burdens, but the fear of going into a second bankruptcy. And we believe that possibility is very much close at hand. The next one, Julie, please. This here was just to be able to create a timeline to demonstrate that the residents of Detroit didn't just get up one day and stop paying their bills, that we were actually forced and legislated by the state of Michigan to build out this massive water infrastructure that provides water to 40% of the state population. If you look at this map and you look at the timeline of the build out, you'll find that it correlates with what was happening in terms of housing policies. You found that as there was more integration in terms of housing policies, white flight began to leave the city of Detroit in the 40s, in the 50s. Many times they racialize the issue and say that it was massive exodus out of the city with the 1967 rebellions, which many people reference as the riots. But the truth is that there had been a moving of the auto industry and the white community out of Detroit from the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s. But then as they were moving out of the city of Detroit, we were also seeing the increase of the legislative bodies that were being influenced by their lobbyists and by their tax dollars to actually leave the burden on the residents of Detroit as they continued to build out this massive infrastructure system. The next one, please, Julie. This one was really important because this was the map that actually was used by many of the experts during the Flint water crisis hearings. This was used by Dr. Peter Hammer, who is a law professor and an economist at Wayne State University. It was also used by Dr. Michael Massenhauser, who is an expert in sociology and water issues at UC Berkeley. And they came to us and said, the community has done a better job than we could even do with it. Can we use your maps as part of the testimonies that we're going to provide as it relates to the racial implementation of emergency management? If you don't know what emergency management is, it is a policy that was shaped by the Mackinac think tank. It was funded by the American Legislative Exchange Council, heavily invested in by the Koch brothers, and it was deeply racially applied in the state of Michigan. Over 53% of the African American population that resides in Michigan has been under this austerity and anti-democratic policy. It was so important for me to lift this because many times citizen science, community-led science does not rise to the level of this kind of acknowledgement and validation. As you heard from Professor Waldron, it's so important that we make sure that we're lifting the fact that those that live in the community are the experts in their own lived experience. By being able to join with those professors and other experts, we were able to demonstrate not only the excellence in terms of community insights, but also the scientific rigor to produce something that was able to be part of the evidence that was rendered during the Flint water crisis hearings. The next one, please. This was important because as we were talking with our researchers and our young people at the Research Collective, one of the things that came to our attention, we were very fixated as older adults on how long the shutoffs had been happening, on what were some of the increases in numbers, and if we saw any patterns in those increases. But what our young folks said is, let's do a little something different. Let's not only look at the trends that we were seeing in Detroit under emergency management, but let's layer over top of that the trends we were seeing in Flint under emergency management at the same time. Because even your news outlets and many of your politicians were not making this connection. It was community. But then it was when we began to see the state sanctioned interventions that were happening by being able to place an unelected, undemocratic leader over the residents of Detroit and Flint, that we saw these harms even more exacerbated. So this is when you saw the ushering in of a Kevin Orr, who was an appointed and unelected emergency manager. But then you also saw that there were critical points where the community rose up. So when we were able to bring in the United Nations with the support of the amazing Maud Barlow and the great legend herself in Detroit, Charity Hicks, that created a situation of national and international attention. So as you see the marker here, as we stood up, as we resisted, as we organized, as we mobilized, they had to step back. They had to adjust their plan. They had to either, then at some point, stop shutting water off. But I always like to lift this because many times people do not connect the dots that the Flint water crisis happened in their rush to steal Detroit's water and sewage department. The next one, please. This here is to demonstrate the inequities and the racist manipulation of the governance structure of the water system. So even though we did not choose or select to go into the Great Lakes Water Authority, it was actually imposed on us through the bankruptcy process. The residents of Detroit, when we owned and fully controlled our own water department, we had a majority representation on that governance body. Now, under a restructuring and regionalization of the system, we actually have a minority representation on an infrastructure that we still are responsible for the maintenance, the overall keep of, and we are still on the hook for the debt. So I don't know about you, but I don't want to own a house that I have to pay for, but I can't live in it. And that is the case as it relates to water in the city of Detroit. We have a right to pay for it, but we don't have a right to drink from it. The next one, please. This year was important because in 2012, one of the things we had to do at We the People of Detroit is that it was very difficult to get any local media coverage. I would suggest to you, if you get a chance, please look up an artist and journalist and investigative reporter by the name of Martina Guzman. She's done a report for a case study that was done on a national scale with PEN America, P-E-N America. But in that report, what Martina was able to demonstrate is that there had been a media blackout of how bad the water shutoffs were in the city of Detroit and how pervasive it was in spreading water-related illnesses. And so We the People of Detroit, we love these opportunities to talk with young people, because what we find is as we're deputizing more young professionals and experts into this work, that they will use their power for the good of the community. And so there was a young man by the name of Alex Plum, who had just recently got a position with the Global Health Initiative at the Henry Ford Health Center. Henry Ford Health Center is one of the largest hospital systems in the state of Michigan. And what Alex said is, he said, Mama Monica, I can't take on the politics of water shutoffs, but I can look and see if there's correlation with health impacts. And so Alex was able to convince the hospital to release to him about 37,000 cases of ER data. And his team was able to lay that data over the water shutoff data that you saw me actually show to you in the first map that was revealed that was blue. As they laid over that document, that data of water shutoffs and hospitalizations related to waterborne illnesses, we found a couple of things. We found that patients that were admitted to Henry Ford that lived on a block that had experienced a water shutoff had a 1.48 times more likelihood of living on a block that experienced shutoffs. One of the things we were fighting too was this master narrative that it's only poor Black and brown people that are too fat, happy, and lazy to pay their fair share that are experiencing water shutoffs and public health impacts. Well, we were able to demonstrate from this research that even if you live on a block where you can pay your water bill, but your neighbor can't pay theirs, it increases the likelihood that you will be exposed to a water-related illness. And then the last thing we were able to do is we were able to use the Social Vulnerability Index to demonstrate at multiple meetings with thought leaders that had not connected the water shutoffs to what was happening to public health in Detroit because of a couple of things. One, Detroit was built for a city of 2 million people. We now have about 728,000. About 178,000 of those are young people 17 and under. On top of that, you have 40% of the population that lives in abject poverty. You have 60% of the population that's headed up by women of color with 2 to 4 children. And then you have 70% of the people that work in the city of Detroit do not live in the city. So they're not experiencing this egregious burden of having to be overtaxed for water debt that you do not owe. Water rates have increased to the tune of 438% over the last 2 decades. And just within the last 2 weeks, the water department for the city of Detroit has raised water rates 3.4%. So as we're seeing the cost of water being increased, as we're seeing water being privatized, we're also seeing our communities having less and less access to this life-sustaining source. The next one, please, Julie. This one here, I think, is probably my last slide. But what it demonstrates is the correlation between what was happening with water shutoffs and then also what was happening with water liens and water debt that was being imposed on homeowners. A couple of things you need to know is that the residents of Detroit up until 1997 had the highest home ownership per capita in the country as it relates to African Americans. So that meant we had a history of not only paying for our homes, owning our homes, but we had a history of maintaining and keeping them up. What we saw is predatory actors, and one of them you may or may not have heard of. He's a billionaire in the US. His name is Dan Gilbert. He owns stock, he owns the Cleveland Cavaliers. He also owns a significant portion of downtown Detroit, because as we were trying to come through the manipulation of this contrived bankruptcy, people were making bad deals with either corporate actors or very influential people that really was selling off the city and burdening the city with tax abatements that we will never be able to pay off for the next 50 to 100 years. And so knowing these things, one of the things that we highlighted is no, it wasn't Detroiters just getting up and abandoning their homes, because one of the narratives at the national level was the last one out, cut the lights off, that there was nothing good left in Detroit, that the Blackness of Detroit had failed in terms of their leadership, and it needed to be sanitized, and Black folks needed to be moved out of the city. Well, one of the quickest ways that you can move a person out of their home, as cold as Michigan can get, you can live in a house with your children with no gas and no lights, but as long as you have water, there is no legal threat to taking your children or removing an elderly person from your home or custody. But there is a law in Michigan that says if you don't have running water for 72 hours, you're in imminent danger of losing your children. There is only one city that this law has been implemented in, and it was aggressively used in the city of Detroit to create fear, to create angst, and to have women of color abandoning properties that had been in their families for 3 and 4 generations, leaving that home, leaving that place of security, just to ensure that their children weren't taken from them. The other thing that's very important to say is that since 2009, at the same time that we were seeing this overburden of water debt on the residents of Detroit, Detroit was also being overtaxed and illegally overburdened with property tax. So it wasn't just the fact that water rates were increasing, but they actually were paying property taxes that they constitutionally did not owe. So if you look at it in terms of the demographics of the city of Detroit, the majority of the pensioners that had their pensions stolen, the average pension was about $19,000 a year. Many of them were paying for healthcare that was costing them anywhere from $150 to $500 a month. Some of them now have had to file for bankruptcy as individually, because now their healthcare is more than what their earnings are. But this to me really makes me come to tears, because I know that for Black and brown folks, their home is part of their generational wealth. It is part of their buying into the American dream. And so to see the city of Detroit in 1 year, in 2014, we saw 15,000 homeowners lose their homes, not because they owed property taxes, they had paid their property taxes, but because these elderly folks and these Black folks on fixed incomes and low incomes were not able to keep pace with the ever increasing cost of water, and wages not keeping pace with that ever increasing cost, found themselves losing their homes and being forced out of the city of Detroit. We would even wager to say that water is being weaponized in Detroit to actually gentrify the city, to make it more welcoming and inviting to more affluent and more white and a younger population into the city of Detroit. The next one, please, Julie, and I think this will do it.
Sorry, Monica, there doesn't seem to be
Another slide.
an
That's the last slide.
All right, that's fabulous. And so I just want to thank you so much for the opportunity to present. Our work still continues today. We played a significant role in evidencing the correlation between what is happening in Detroit and water shutoffs and COVID-19. I've added some of those case studies into the chat. I'm hoping that we can share that with you, and looking forward to the Q&A portion of this session.
Thank you so much, Monica. That was amazing. Thank you for providing your insight onto environmental racism issues specifically in Detroit. So we are going to go into our Q&A session. So students from the Arts 490 class have posed several questions to both panelists to understand more about environmental racism and the work that both of you do. So our first question is, so you both mobilized communities to combat environmental racism. How can students interested in water and health advocate for these communities to help bring voices of the communities to the forefront and help in environmental justice research?
Well, there's nothing stopping students from doing everything that we do, right? I talked about the coalition that I co-founded, where we brought together organizations, but as well as students and community members to support a campaign for Bill C-226, to do activism in communities, to be part of policy change, to be involved in education. So specifically with respect to the communities on the ground, the communities that have been impacted, students are often interested in doing that type of work. And I think the best way to engage in that work is to get to know the communities that are most impacted. So read about them, get to know the communities in your area. What are they dealing with? Learn about them, but also start to show up at events, right? So when I was in Nova Scotia, these communities always posted on their Facebook, social media pages what they're doing. Keep abreast of that through social media, and to show up at events. You then slowly develop relationships with communities. That's how I did it. You know, I showed up, I showed my face. I wanted people to get to know me. I developed relationships with them, organic, authentic relationships. They're now my friends. And they got to know me, and then they got to trust me, because in various cases, there's no reason why they should trust me. Even with the Black community in Nova Scotia, I'm not an African Nova Scotian. You know, I was born in Montreal, so it doesn't necessarily mean that just because I'm Black, they're going to necessarily accept me. So I had to do that work. And I also had to give something back to the community. You know, I think it's important to give something back to the community. So students can do that work in terms of connecting with communities through their social media pages. Another great way is to get onto the social media pages and get involved in the petitions that they post, the campaigns through various ENGOs, right? Find a reputable ENGO, whether you think it's David Suzuki Foundation or something else that you like. They always have campaigns going. Get involved in that. Education and training. Students could also get involved in that in terms of presenting your work. Helping to organize events. That's one way to get involved with people who are on the front lines of organizing around environmental justice issues, but also getting to the community. So I think every single thing that I said today, I don't really do it as a professor necessarily. I do it as just somebody who's interested, and there's absolutely no reason why students can't do the same thing. Op-eds, write op-eds, get on committees in the community, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, thank you so much. So there is a follow-up question to this, and Monica, you can feel free to answer this one. So have there been any updates to the education systems on including environmental justice and racism in curriculums? And Dr. Waldron, also feel free to jump in on this question.
Well, I think you probably heard that there is a major battle ensuing in the US around critical race theory.
Yeah.
So when you start talking about environmental justice, I have to lift up, as Dr. Waldron has already spoken to, we have so many amazing elders that have carried this work for generations. As I came into this work, I came into it from a social justice lens. I did not see myself as an environmental justice person. And many times when I heard the term environmental justice, I was hearing it espoused from white folks that were doing conservation work. And it wasn't until I had an encounter with one of my elders, the amazing Rhonda Anderson, who is one of the Black women that sort of fought through all of the racist issues that were happening at Sierra Club, a predominantly large, green, well-funded organization. She started out as one of 3 Black women in that entire entity nationally. And she pulled me to the side and she said, Monica, she said, I'm just going to tell you something. You can't be a good social justice person advocating for your community without being a good environmental justice person. And so it was from her that I began to be able to look at this issue differently. And then I began to seek others that were operating in the institutions of higher learning that were intersecting the issues of environmental justice with, you know, cognitive issues, with incarceration, with what was happening with food security and just things of that nature. And so we were always looking for the leveraging point. How could we bring greater attention to what the community says their needs are, what their concerns are, and then also at the same time being reshaped in my own mind, and also the other women that served with me, in understanding that the fight that we were fighting for water affordability was deeply connected to all of these other struggles.
Thank you so much. So what advice do you have for navigating a new field or a new environment that you don't feel very knowledgeable in? Because I know both of you said that you work with interdisciplinary teams. So for people who do want to do something similar, what advice do you have for someone who may not have the expertise in one area, but they do want to work in an interdisciplinary environment?
My main advice is just do it. I knew absolutely nothing about environmental racism back in 2012, never ever heard of the term, introduced to the term by an environmental activist in Nova Scotia. Have no environmental science background. My background is sociology of race. And I was intimidated when he asked me, you know, why don't you do a project on environmental racism? I was intimidated. I thought I needed to have a particular educational background. Now that I've done it, I realize that you should never let what you don't know stop you, or how should I put it? Just because you don't know everything about a topic doesn't mean that you shouldn't start doing the work, which is exactly what I did. I came into this knowing that I had a lot to learn. I was intimidated, fearful that I didn't have the right background, but I realized that that is what teams are about. That's what partnership is about. When you have partnerships, you build partnerships, they're filling the gaps. And thank God it didn't scare me that much that I did not start this project. So I built a team around me of environmental scientists and hydrogeologists and political scientists, and I've moved forward. So I think for this topic and any topic, don't wait until you know everything to do something.
Thank you. Did you have anything to add to that, Monica?
I would just say we probably entered the work a little bit different. We came into the work really looking to be solutionaries in terms of the issues that we were experiencing around water disparity. As one of our elders said, we didn't even know what we didn't know. What we knew is that we could not continue to allow the austerity that was playing out, that was denying our community and our elders access to clean, safe, and affordable water. So one of our elders, Professor Gwen Winston, she brought us together and she said, you guys can't keep meeting with other activists. You're going to have to go into some meetings, some other settings with people that actually are on the polar end of where you are about water equity, water security. And it was her challenging us and pushing us and going into some of those rooms where people were extremely hostile, very racist, had very major biases about how we got to the point we got to in Detroit. But it was a commitment. And one of the things she told me, she said, your community didn't send you into the room to just be in the room. They sent you in the room to make sure that you make sure everybody in that room is clear about the imminent threat to continuing to deny the human right to water and to continue to make water unaffordable. So it was really the shepherding of those elders, of those Black and Indigenous women that sort of deputized me into movement and leadership that forced us and compelled us to some tables we had never even thought existed. I serve on the International Joint Commission for the Great Lakes with Dr. Kelsey Leonard here at Waterloo. I didn't even know that that existed 5 years ago, 6 years ago. So then to be named to that table and be able to influence that table, it shifted some of the thinking of the hearts and minds of the people that are at that table, but it has also brought back to our community resources, data, and research that has elevated the voices of our community. So we really sought our way into being solutionaries at these tables, and we weren't waiting for anybody to rescue us or to lead us. We were leading ourselves, and then as we began to deputize ourselves in our own work, others came along. We also thought it was really important, and this is one of the things Dr. Waldron talked about. It was so important that community knew that the research that we were seeking was their research. It was their data, and that they were the center of every question that we were posing to anyone. And so to me, I started pitching myself to even be on this panel with Dr. Waldron and having this conversation at the University of Waterloo, because I am by trade, I'm a clinician. I'm a trained therapist, and my background is in special education. So nothing in my background says that I should be here other than my compassion for my community, my self-determination, and then the women that I have the honor of serving with have pushed me to go further than I ever dreamed I'd go.
Thank you. That's amazing advice from you too. So just really, you kind of have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable and continuously learning about, fields you don't know, because you're not going to know everything, but you will provide your expertise anyway. So that's excellent advice. So another question that we have is, over the course of your journey, have you faced obstacles when trying to reach out to those in communities facing water challenges? Have you encountered any resistance from within the communities you're working with who are affected by environmental racism?
Yes. Community-based research is really difficult. I think people think it's easy. Oh, it's community-based. You're Black, they're Black. What could be so difficult about it? It's actually much more difficult, because if you make a misstep, the trust is gone and you may never get that trust back. And there was an assumption that I knew what community-based research was. I didn't. I was working my way through it, just like everybody else. I didn't know what it meant, I should be doing. And the main challenge I had a challenge with P2 Landing First Nation in Nova Scotia that was dealing with the boat harbor issue. And I didn't read the temperature of the community. I contacted by email the Chief Andrea Paul, and I said, I'd like to come up to the community and meet the community and look at the issue of environmental racism. Unbeknownst to me, lots of other Dalhousie professors were up there collecting data. So she sent me a very curt email back saying, we have enough Dalhousie professors up here, please don't come. And I was like, whoa, I was kind of hurt by that. But I didn't realize at that point that I shouldn't have been hurt. It's about, did I get a sense of the context? Did I read the temperature of the community? Just because I was interested in coming up doesn't mean that right now they want me to come up. Now, I did visit the community 4 years later, and I finally met everyone. And I'm on Facebook with Andrea Paul now. But at that time, I didn't recognize that it's not about what I want at that given time. It's what the community wants, and it's about building relationships. She didn't know who I was. So for all those years, I felt for quite a few years, oh, P2 Landing First Nation doesn't want me up there. And then I came to this kind of resolution that it's not really about me. It's about building relationships slowly and gradually. And then in 2017, a community activist who I've known for years from P2 Landing First Nation, who's been on my Facebook page, he said, I've been watching you, Ingrid, I've been watching you, and I really like what you're doing. I'd really like you to come up to the community. And so it was the right time. It was 4 years later, but it was the right time. The other issue was the Black community of Lincolnville. I didn't, once again, read the temperature of the community. I did not realize that there were some people who had no issues with the landfill. I assumed that the whole Black community hated the landfill being there, but there was a segment of the community that were just fine with it and wanted the landfill to stay, and another segment of the Black community that wanted it to go. So as I was speaking to the people who I assumed wanted the landfill to go, I realized in the phone conversation that they thought it was just fine. And they said to me, oh, Ingrid, what are you listening to? You're listening to the people who don't want the landfill there. Don't listen to them. And I realized that there's a division in any community. So did I do the proper research or just speaking to people about how the whole community feels about this landfill? I made an assumption that it's a landfill, so everybody doesn't want it there. So this is community-based research. It requires you to go the distance a little bit. And because I was learning about community-based research, I didn't know that. These issues highlight the need to take your time to build relationships before you start collecting any data. So that's what I learned. And I talk about this in the book. That's what I learned from doing the work.
Thank you, Ingrid. Monica, did you want to add anything on top of that?
Just very quickly, I think one of the most profound moments we had is that we had been invited to an Indigenous ceremony and gathering in the UP. And Deborah Taylor, who is a co-founder and CFO at We the People of Detroit, she and I both went there with a large contingency of young folks. Well, the weather turned bad, and those young folks decided they wanted to get back to Detroit before the snow hit. And the grandmothers whispered to Deborah and I and said, "We don't suggest you leave. You should stay." And so, honoring the grandmothers there in the community, we decided to stay. Well, that one night stay turned into 3 days. But what it did is it opened up, because we were respectful, because we honored their recommendations, we were attentive to their concerns. We got invited into some sacred circles where we were able to share and hear and listen and build. And so it's been ever since that kind of attentiveness, because we weren't there about the issues that were happening in Detroit with predominantly Black folks. We were there to build solidarity with Native American and Indigenous folks. But the beauty of the moment was one that we were able, as we learned from them and we were respectful of their process and their way and their gentleness, we were able to then interject into that conversation what was happening to Black folks in Detroit and Flint and across Michigan and the Great Lakes. And since then, it has been a powerful exchange between those women, those grandmothers. As I say, that 3 days of being snowed in with them, I think it changed our lives in terms of how we began to appreciate water in a deeper and more spiritual way.
Thank you so much. It's really good to hear, especially your struggles with community-based research. It is a lot about understanding and respecting the communities that you are researching, because you are looking from outside looking in. So that's amazing that you could actually share that expertise with us. So this is now the end of our Q&A session, but if anybody here does have any questions about today's presentation, we do have an email in the chat, water.institute@uwaterloo.ca. And I'll just call on Kevin to wrap us up.
Yes, thank you, Ashley. Unfortunately, I wish we could keep this discussion going, but we have reached the end of our session. So just on behalf of the Water Institute and the University of Waterloo and all the graduate students and undergraduate students, we really wish to thank both of you for coming today and speaking and for highlighting this ongoing legacy and the consequences of environmental racism. And we hope that for all of you attending today, that this session makes you reflect on the social and the political causes of environmental issues that continue to affect people in Canada, North America, and around the entire world. And so finally, we want to thank you, our audience, for joining us this afternoon. And we really hope that you enjoy the rest of your World Water Day, and we will see you next year. So thanks again. Goodbye.
Thanks. Bye-bye, Monica.
So grateful for you, Dr. Waldron.
And to you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Water Institute.